The small town of Ashwood, still sleepy from its Sunday slumber, stretched beneath a clear blue sky. Sunlight bathed the red brick sidewalks, glinting off windows of quaint little shops that lined the main street. The kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Joe Morrison adjusted his worn military cap, the fabric soft from decades of use, its embroidered insignia telling silent stories of wars fought and sacrifices made. At 83, Joe carried himself with a dignity that belied his age. His posture was still strong, shoulders squared as if he were marching to a tune only he could hear. His weathered face bore the marks of time, deep lines etched from both hardship and laughter, and his dark brown eyes, though clouded slightly with age, held a spark of quiet determination. He had seen the best and the worst of humanity, both on foreign battlefields and within the borders of his own country. Yet, despite it all, Joe Morrison remained a man of patience and hope. His simple pleasures these days were walks around town, reading the paper, and sitting down for a hearty breakfast at a cozy cafe. Today, however, Joe had decided to break routine. His usual spot, a diner he'd frequented for years, was closed for renovations. That small disruption led him to the Sunnyside Café, a new establishment praised by neighbors for its hot coffee and home-style breakfasts. He had heard about their scrambled eggs, the best in Ashwood, and that alone was enough to tempt him. The small bell above the door jingled softly as Joe stepped inside. Warm air, rich with the smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits, enveloped him. Sunlight poured through the large front windows, casting a golden glow over mismatched wooden tables and cushioned booths. A cheerful chalkboard near the counter read, "Welcome to Sunnyside Café, where good food brings good people together." Joe smiled faintly at the sentiment and scanned the room. The cafe was bustling but not crowded. Couples lingered over steaming mugs of coffee. Families laughed softly over stacks of pancakes, and a few lone patrons sat at the counter, absorbed in their newspapers. It was a place alive with warmth and the quiet hum of small-town life. Joe moved carefully toward an empty booth near the window, leaning slightly on his cane for support. His military jacket, adorned with ribbons and pins, caught the attention of a few patrons. Some offered respectful nods, while others turned away, pretending not to notice. He settled into the booth, his posture as straight as it had been during his days in uniform. The seat creaked slightly beneath him, but it was comfortable, and the morning sunlight streaming in felt good against his hands. Hands worn from years of hard work and service. A young waitress approached with a smile that lit up her face. "Good morning, sir," she said cheerfully. Her name tag read Molly. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" Joe nodded, returning her smile. "Yes, please. Black, if you don't mind." "Coming right up," Molly replied, turning back toward the counter with a bounce in her step. Joe sighed contentedly, glancing out the window at the quiet street. He could almost hear the echo of another Sunday morning, decades ago, himself as a young man, wearing a freshly pressed uniform, his mother's voice encouraging him to make something of himself. His quiet reverie was broken when he noticed a shadow approaching his table. The shift in the room's energy was subtle but unmistakable. The cheerful hum of conversation seemed to dull just a bit as Joe looked up and met the eyes of the man now standing beside his booth. Hank Dawson. Joe didn't know him personally, but he recognized the man as the owner of the Sunnyside Café. Hank was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a bald head that gleamed under the overhead lights. His features were sharp, his mouth pressed into a hard line, and his piercing gaze carried an edge that made Joe's spine straighten instinctively. "Something I can help you with?" Joe asked politely, though he could already feel the tension coiling in the air like a snake ready to strike. Hank didn't smile. He crossed his arms over his chest, his voice curt and cold. "We're full up today." Joe blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt statement. He glanced around the cafe, noting several empty tables and stools at the counter. "Oh," Joe said slowly, his voice calm but steady. "I see a few open seats there." Hank's face hardened further, his tone dropping. "We're full. You'll have to leave." A hush settled over the cafe. Conversations faltered, and eyes began to turn toward the unfolding scene. Joe's jaw tightened slightly, but his demeanor remained composed. He had faced worse in his life than an unkind man trying to dismiss him. "I don't want any trouble, sir," Joe said firmly. "I just wanted to have some breakfast like everyone else here." Hank leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I said we're full. You're not welcome here." The words stung more than Joe cared to admit. They were familiar, echoes from a time he had tried to believe was behind him. Yet here they were, as raw and painful as ever. The room was now completely silent, save for the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen. A murmur began to ripple through the other patrons. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting uncertain glances at Joe and Hank. Others stared openly, as if watching a scene from a play. In the corner of the cafe, a group of men in leather jackets sat quietly. Their table had been loud moments before, full of laughter and the scrape of silverware, but now they were still, their gazes fixed on Hank and Joe. The leader of the group, a tall man with graying hair and a rugged face, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing as he observed the situation. Joe remained seated, his hand resting lightly on the table, his grip steady despite the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. He looked up at Hank, his voice soft but filled with quiet resolve. "I've served this country, son," Joe said. "All I'm asking for is a meal." For a fleeting moment, Hank faltered, as if the weight of Joe's words had struck something deep within him. But just as quickly his scowl returned and he straightened up, his voice loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. "I don't care what you did," Hank sneered. "You need to leave. Now." A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the room. Molly, the waitress, had frozen mid-step, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. A couple near the window exchanged nervous whispers, and one of the men at the counter folded his newspaper with a loud snap. From the corner table, the leader of the leather-clad group set down his fork with a quiet, deliberate motion. His eyes remained on Joe, something unreadable flickering in their depths. Joe inhaled deeply, his hand steadying against the edge of the table as he rose to his feet. He adjusted his cap, his movements deliberate, and turned toward the door. But as he stepped forward, a chair scraped loudly across the floor, breaking the silence. The man from the corner table stood up. "Where do you think you're going, sir?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the room. All eyes turned toward the man, and the tension in the room shifted, as if the tide had suddenly turned. As Joe Morrison stepped outside the Sunnyside Café, the quiet of the morning seemed to press against him. He adjusted his cap with careful hands, his shoulders still straight, but his mind was anything but steady. For a man who had faced artillery fire and the harshest trials life could hurl, this moment of humiliation should have felt small. Yet it gnawed at him, a sharp, familiar ache he hadn't felt in years. Joe took a slow breath, turning his gaze to the horizon. The town of Ashwood seemed to mock him with its calm normalcy. People strolled the streets, mothers guided their children to shops, and sunlight bathed everything in an idyllic glow. It was the kind of town that looked perfect on the outside, but carried cracks beneath its polished surface. The encounter replayed in Joe's mind. "We're full. You're not welcome here." Hank's words lingered like the smoke of a distant fire, stinging his pride and cutting far deeper than they should have. It wasn't the first time Joe had heard those words, or words like them, but he had hoped, after all these years, they had become relics of a past best forgotten. With nowhere to go and no appetite left, Joe turned onto the narrow path that led to the park. His steps were steady, his cane tapping softly on the pavement as he walked, each step carrying him deeper into memory. Joe could still see it clearly in his mind's eye, the train station in the heart of his small southern town. The day he left home to join the army, he had barely turned 18. The war was raging across the world, and every young man he knew was leaving, some willingly, others drafted. Joe had been eager, determined, He remembered how his mother, a strong woman with a soft voice, had clasped his hand tightly before he boarded the train. "You be safe out there, Joe. And you remember what I told you. You're just as good as any man. Don't let nobody tell you different." Her words echoed in his heart through boot camp, through deployments, and through every moment he spent far from home. She had raised him to believe in his own worth, even in a world determined to tell him otherwise. Those first days in the Army had been an awakening. Joe had never been more proud than when he put on that uniform for the first time. The stiff jacket and polished boots transformed him. He looked in the mirror and saw more than just a boy from a forgotten town. He saw a soldier, a man who could make a difference. But even in the ranks, segregation followed him. His unit was all black, commanded by white officers. Joe remembered the sting of marching past mess halls, where white soldiers sat and ate, while he and his brothers were forced to take their meals elsewhere. It didn't matter that they fought the same battles, bled the same blood. Separate and unequal was the unspoken rule. Still, Joe held his head high. He knew he was part of something greater than himself. He had a job to do, and he intended to do it with honor. The flashbacks came easily now, unbidden and raw. Joe could see it. The muddy trenches of Europe, the air thick with smoke and gunpowder. Nights were filled with the distant rumble of explosions and the quiet sobs of scared boys trying to act like men. He thought of Marcus, his closest friend in the unit, whose laughter could light up the darkest nights. "We're going to come back home, heroes, Joe," Marcus would say, a grin splitting his face even as mortars fell around them. "They'll finally see what we're made of." Marcus didn't come home. Joe's throat tightened at the memory. He had carried Marcus's body back to the medic tent, his friend's blood staining his hands. Joe had promised Marcus's mother he would look out for him. That promise still haunted him. When the war ended, Joe returned home to parades in some towns, but not in his. Ashwood didn't greet its black veterans with open arms. Instead, they returned to the same old rules, the same old stares. Uniform or not, Joe was reminded that his place hadn't changed. "Boy, don't go thinking that uniform makes you better than us," a gas station attendant once sneered at Joe when he dared to pay with cash instead of using the back entrance. Joe had stood silently, his fists clenched tight, the weight of his medals heavy on his chest. The years that followed were marked by fire and change. Joe watched as the country he had fought for began to reckon with itself. He saw hope in Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, in the marches on television, in the brave men and women sitting at lunch counters demanding dignity. Joe joined his share of protests, too, quietly, with his military cap still perched on his head. He walked with others like him, believing that the sacrifices he and his brothers had made would mean something in the end. But progress was slow, too slow. He remembered one particular protest in a neighboring town. Police had shown up with dogs and batons, and Joe had watched young students, barely older than children, beaten for daring to demand a seat at the table. That night, as Joe cleaned blood from his face, he had stared long and hard at his reflection. The same face that had stared out from under his army helmet now looked tired, worn, yet the fire in his chest never went out. America was his home, too. He had earned his place here. Now, decades later, Joe sat on a park bench as the morning sun climbed higher, bathing him in its warmth. Birds chirped in the trees, and the distant laughter of children playing echoed faintly in the breeze. He leaned back, his cane resting against his knee, and sighed. It wasn't the worst thing that had happened to him. Not by a long shot, but something about Hank's words still stung. "You're not welcome here." Joe had faced hatred before. He had faced it in the ranks, at lunch counters, in his own town. He had walked through it with his head held high, because that's what a soldier does. But at 83 years old, he had hoped he wouldn't have to fight those battles anymore. All he wanted was scrambled eggs and coffee, a simple meal, a quiet morning. "Guess I was asking for too much," he muttered to himself. Joe closed his eyes for a moment, the faces of his fallen brothers passing through his mind. Marcus's laugh. His mother's voice telling him to stand tall. The protests, the struggles, the hope. Even now, he loved this country. Despite its flaws, despite the wounds it sometimes inflicted, it was his. He had given it everything he had. He carried his love for it in the quiet pride of his military cap, and the weight of the medals he kept tucked away in an old box at home. Joe opened his eyes, his resolve hardening. He had survived worse than Hank Dawson. This was just another moment, another test, in a life full of battles won and lost. Straightening his shoulders, Joe stood up, his cane tapping against the pavement. The war wasn't over yet, and maybe, just maybe, this time, someone else would stand with him. The faint creak of the floor beneath Joe Morrison's feet seemed to echo louder than it should as he turned toward the door. The hushed silence in the Sunnyside Café wrapped around him, heavy and suffocating. He straightened his military cap with steady hands, determined to maintain his dignity even in the face of humiliation. At 83 years old, Joe had been through enough to know that some battles weren't worth fighting, not when the opponent was a man like Hank Dawson. Still, the sting of his words lingered. "We're full. You're not welcome here." Joe gripped the handle of his cane and took a step forward. But before he could leave, the sound of a chair scraping loudly across the floor shattered the stillness like a crack of thunder. All eyes turned to the corner of the room. It was a table of bikers. They'd been there the whole time. A group of 6 men dressed in worn leather jackets and faded jeans, their boots scuffed and their faces rugged. Joe had noticed them when he first entered, laughing and joking loudly over their breakfasts, their heavy presence seemingly at odds with the cafe's cozy atmosphere. Most people avoided them, giving their table a wide berth. Now, they were standing. The leader of the group, a man whose imposing frame seemed to take up more space than it should, rose slowly to his full height. He had broad shoulders, a barrel chest, and a face weathered by time and experience. A thick gray beard framed his jawline, and when he spoke, his voice was a low rumble that carried easily across the cafe. "Hold on a minute, sir," he said, directing his words toward Joe. Joe froze mid-step and turned his head, his eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. The biker leader took a deliberate step forward, his boots thudding softly against the floor. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Joe blinked, surprised by the question. "Home," he replied evenly. "It seems I'm not wanted here." The biker shook his head slowly, his sharp gray eyes never leaving Joe's face. "Oh, you're wanted here, all right. It's him who's the problem." The cafe seemed to collectively inhale as the biker turned his attention to Hank Dawson, the cafe's owner. Hank, who had been watching with a smug expression, flinched slightly as the biker's gaze landed on him. "What business is this of yours, Grizzly?" Hank demanded, his bravado faltering. Grizzly. The name fit the biker leader perfectly, and Joe stored it away in his mind as the man crossed his arms over his broad chest. "It's my business because I don't like what I'm seeing," Grizzly replied. His voice was steady and even, but there was a steel edge to it that made the room feel smaller. "This man," he gestured toward Joe, "fought for this country, same as us, and I'll be damned if I stand here and let you treat him like he doesn't belong." Hank's face turned red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. "I don't need you or your friends telling me how to run my business," he snapped, though his voice trembled slightly. Grizzly's lip curled in a half-smile, though there was no humor in it. "And yet, here we are." He glanced back at his table, and one by one, the other bikers stood up. The room seemed to hold its breath as they approached, their movements slow and deliberate. Joe watched, stunned, as the group positioned themselves between him and Hank's counter. Their presence was a wall, unmovable, unyielding. Joe had always believed appearances could be deceiving, and now he was certain of it. These men, with their leather jackets and gruff exteriors, were standing up for him in a way he never would have expected. "You see this?" Grizzly said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Hank flinched slightly, as if expecting something threatening, but what Grizzly pulled out was a worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted an ID and held it up for everyone to see. Joe squinted and his heart leapt as he recognized it immediately. A military service ID. United States Army, Grizzly announced proudly. He turned to Joe and gave a small nod of respect. Vietnam, 1970. The 101st Airborne. Joe's lips parted slightly in surprise. Airborne? Grizzly grinned faintly. Yes, sir. Jumped out of a lot of perfectly good airplanes. Made it home in one piece, though. Mostly, at that, the other bikers began to reveal their own stories. One by one, they held up worn IDs, rolled up sleeves to show faded tattoos, or quietly named their units. Army, Marines, Navy, the Air Force. Each of them had served, some in Vietnam, others in Desert Storm or Afghanistan. Men who had worn the same uniforms Joe once did, who had fought the same battles and carried the same burdens. We know what it means to serve, Grizzly said, his voice quiet but powerful. And we know what it feels like to come home to a country that doesn't always show you the respect you've earned. That's why we're not letting this go. Hank's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confidence he'd wielded so easily before was crumbling under the weight of the bikers' stares and the truth they carried. I think it's time you apologize to Mr. Morrison, Grizzly said, his voice hardening. Hank sputtered. Apologize? For what? I told him the truth. We're full. Liar, came a voice from the counter. Molly, the waitress, had stepped forward, her face pale but determined. You're lying, Hank, and you know it. Hank turned to her, his face twisted in anger, but Molly didn't back down. I'll serve Mr. Morrison myself, she said. And if you don't like it, you can fire me. But I won't stand here and watch you treat someone like that. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Joe could see other customers nodding, their earlier silence breaking under the weight of what they'd witnessed. Grizzly turned back to Joe and gestured toward his former table. Sir, you're welcome to sit with us. We'd be honored to buy you breakfast. For a moment, Joe couldn't speak. He was overwhelmed by the unexpected support, the quiet strength of these men who, moments ago, had been strangers. He felt the lump in his throat and fought to keep his voice steady as he finally said, Thank you. I'd be proud to join you. Grizzly smiled, a genuine smile that softened the sharp lines of his face. Come on, then. Let's eat. Joe turned back to glance at Hank one last time, but the man was already retreating into the kitchen, his face flushed with shame. As the bikers guided Joe to their table, the cafe buzzed with energy, a mixture of awe, relief, and quiet triumph. Joe sat down at the table with Grizzly and his men, his back straight, his head held high. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was fighting alone. The air inside the Sunnyside Café was thick with tension, like the stillness before a storm. Every eye in the room darted between Hank Dawson, the cafe's owner, and the group of bikers who now stood as a united wall around Joe Morrison. The sound of forks clinking on plates and quiet murmurs had been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock above the counter. Hank, his face flushed crimson, stood rooted to the floor, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His bravado, though shaken, returned like a wave of boiling anger. This is M.Y. Place, he barked, his voice louder and harsher than before. The veins in his neck bulged as he jabbed a trembling finger toward the bikers. You hear me? I'm the owner here. You're all trespassing. A collective gasp rippled through the room, but the bikers remained unmoved. They stood tall, calm, and resolute, their presence a quiet declaration that they wouldn't be intimidated. Tom Grizzly Green, their leader, didn't flinch under Hank's glare. Instead, he took a single step forward, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the space between them. Nobody here is trespassing, Grizzly said, his voice deep and measured. We're paying customers, just like everyone else. And this man, he nodded toward Joe, has just as much right to sit here as anybody. Hank's face twisted in fury. He doesn't belong here, and neither do you. This is my business, and I make the rules. The room felt smaller now, the tension like a vice squeezing everyone within it. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Some nodded subtly in agreement with Grizzly and the bikers, while others looked away, unwilling to pick a side. "Hank, you're out of line," a voice said quietly, breaking the silence. It was Sarah, the young waitress who had served Joe earlier. Her voice trembled slightly, but she stepped forward, her notepad still clutched tightly in her hands. All eyes turned to her. Hank's head snapped in her direction, his glare searing. "Stay out of this, Sarah. You don't know what you're talking about." Sarah's pale face was resolute despite her fear. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering as she looked at her boss. "No, Hank, I do know what I'm talking about. This isn't right, and you know it." Her words seemed to ripple through the room, like a small spark in dry brush. A murmur broke out among the customers, whispers of agreement and indignation. Joe, seated quietly at the table surrounded by bikers, watched Sarah with something close to admiration. Hank's face darkened further. "You're speaking out of turn, girl," he snapped. "If you don't want to lose your job, I suggest you keep your mouth shut." For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her notepad, the weight of Hank's threat hanging heavy in the air. But then she lifted her chin, her voice stronger than before. "Go ahead and fire me, Hank," she said. "I'm not going to stand here and watch you treat a man like that. Not Mr. Morrison. Not anyone." A wave of quiet approval swept through the cafe. A man sitting at the counter folded his newspaper and turned to face Hank. "She's right, you know," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You're out of line." Another voice spoke up, this one from a table near the door. "Yeah, Hank, this isn't how you treat people." Hank's eyes darted wildly around the room as more and more people began to nod or murmur their agreement. The tide was shifting, and he could feel it. His authority, his control over the room, was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You all think you can gang up on me?" he spat, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll call the police. You hear me? Every one of you is out of here. I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace." The room fell silent once more, all eyes turning back to Grizzly. The biker leader met Hank's glare with an unshakable calm. He slowly crossed his arms over his chest, his stance unmovable. "Go ahead," Grizzly said evenly. "Call the police. We're not breaking any laws. We're standing up for a brother, a man who served this country with honor. And I'm willing to bet that when the police get here, they'll see it the same way we do." The challenge in his words hung heavy in the air. Hank opened his mouth to retort, but faltered, glancing around the cafe. His confidence wavered as he saw the expressions of his customers, their disapproval, their disappointment. Even the few who had initially avoided taking a side were now staring at him with something close to disgust. In the corner, Joe remained seated, silent but watchful. He didn't speak, but the lines of his face, softened by age, were filled with pride, not for himself, but for the strangers who now stood beside him, for the young waitress who had risked her job, for the bikers who carried the same burdens he did and who refused to let him bear this moment alone. "This ain't over," Hank growled finally, his voice losing its bluster. He took a step back toward the kitchen door, his shoulders hunched, his face twisted with anger and shame. "You'll all regret this." Grizzly didn't move an inch as Hank retreated. The cafe remained silent until the door swung shut behind him with a sharp bang. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. Sarah turned to Joe, her face softening. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry about all this. You shouldn't have had to go through it." Joe met her gaze, his expression gentle. "Thank you, Sarah. That took courage." Grizzly clapped a hand on Joe's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You're not alone, sir. Not now, not ever." Joe nodded slowly, his voice low but steady. I see that now, and I appreciate it more than I can say. Around the cafe, people began to relax, conversations resuming in hushed tones. The tension had lifted, though the events of the morning would not be soon forgotten. For now, the bikers took their seats again, inviting Joe to join them at their table. As Joe settled into his chair, he realized something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. These men, these strangers, had stood up for him without hesitation. Sarah had spoken up when it mattered most, and the community, once silent, had found its voice. Outside the cafe, the morning sun continued its quiet climb, casting its light on a day that had already begun to change everything. The soft hum of conversation in the Sunnyside Cafe was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. Hank Dawson had finally made good on his threat to call the police. For a moment, the tension that had begun to ease after his retreat returned, settling over the room like a heavy fog. Tom Grizzly Green and the bikers remained calm, sitting around Joe Morrison as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Their quiet confidence seemed to act as a shield, protecting Joe from the storm that was Hank's anger. Sarah, the young waitress, hovered nervously nearby, her hands wringing the edge of her apron as she glanced at the door. "It'll be all right," Grizzly said softly to Joe, sensing his unease. "We're not in the wrong here." Joe nodded slightly, though his shoulders remained stiff. His instincts, honed through years of navigating these very moments, told him to be cautious. He had seen too many situations like this spiral out of control. The distant screech of tires outside made him grip his cane a little tighter. The cafe door swung open, and two police officers stepped inside. Their crisp uniforms and polished boots seemed to cut to the warmth of the cafe, drawing every eye in the room. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, scanned the room before settling his gaze on Hank, who had reappeared from the kitchen like a predator sensing fresh prey. "I'm glad you're here, Officer Wallace," Hank said loudly, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "These people are disturbing the peace and refusing to leave my establishment." Grizzly rose slowly to his feet, his massive frame once again commanding the room. "We're not disturbing anything," he said calmly, his deep voice carrying an authority that matched the officer's. "We're paying customers, sitting here, minding our business. And this man," he gestured toward Joe, who was still seated, "was denied service for no good reason. That's what this is about." Officer Wallace's eyes flicked to Joe. For a moment, the officer's stern expression softened. He recognized Joe's cap, the military insignia, the quiet dignity of the man sitting at the table. Wallace straightened, addressing Joe directly. "Sir," he said respectfully, "is this true?" Joe nodded, his voice steady but low. "I came here for breakfast, same as anyone else. Mr. Dawson told me to leave, said I wasn't welcome." A murmur swept through the room. Hank's face turned red again, but he didn't back down. "I have the right to refuse service to anyone. It's my cafe, my rules." Officer Wallace turned back to Hank, his face hardening. "Mr. Dawson," he said firmly, "you might own this establishment, but you don't have the right to refuse service based on personal prejudice. These men have every right to be here. And so does Mr. Morrison." Hank sputtered, his jaw working as if searching for words. "But that's enough," Wallace said, cutting him off. His tone brooked no argument. "Maybe it's time you think about your actions." A low hum of approval rippled through the room. Some of the customers who had remained silent before now nodded or murmured in agreement. Hank turned on his heel and stormed back into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Officer Wallace turned to Grizzly and the bikers. "You're not causing any trouble here, so you're free to stay as long as you'd like." Then, addressing Joe, he added, "Sir, if you need anything, don't hesitate to call us." Joe gave the officer a small nod of thanks, the lines of tension around his mouth easing slightly. As the officers exited the cafe, the energy in the room shifted. Relief began to take root, mingling with something else, something stronger. Grizzly turned to Joe and clapped a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Told you it'd be all right," he said, a faint grin pulling at the corners of his mouth. Word traveled quickly in Ashwood. By the time the sun rose the next day, the events at the Sunnyside Café had become the talk of the town. People shared hushed accounts of the confrontation over morning coffee, while others posted the story on social media, adding their voices to the growing outrage. And then the bikers returned. By mid-morning, a line of motorcycles stretched down Main Street, their chrome and leather gleaming in the sunlight. Dozens of bikers, men and women alike, gathered outside the cafe, their presence both peaceful and powerful. They didn't shout or cause a scene. They simply stood together, a silent protest against injustice. Among them were townspeople, neighbors who had heard what happened and felt compelled to join. Young families, elderly couples, shop owners, all stood shoulder to shoulder with the bikers. Some held homemade signs. "Justice for Joe." Respect has no color. This is everyone's cafe. At the center of it all sat Joe Morrison, perched on a folding chair beneath the shade of a large oak tree. He had been hesitant at first, unsure if he wanted this much attention, but Grizzly had insisted. "You started something important," Grizzly had told him. "Now, let's make sure people hear it." Joe watched the growing crowd with quiet amazement. A lifetime of experiences had taught him to be cautious, to temper his expectations, but this was something he hadn't seen before. Strangers standing up, not just for him, but for what was right. He thought back to his days in the service, to the battlefields of Europe and the friendships forged in the fires of war. He remembered Marcus, his closest friend, who used to say, "We fight for freedom, Joe, because everyone deserves it." Joe swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. This, he thought, is what freedom looks like. By early afternoon, news crews arrived, cameras rolling as reporters set up just outside the cafe. A young reporter approached Joe, microphone in hand. "Mr. Morrison," she began, "you've become the face of what many are calling a movement for dignity and respect. How do you feel about all of this?" Joe looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of years. "All I wanted was breakfast. But I'm glad folks are standing up. We fought for freedom overseas, and this is freedom right here. People standing together, looking out for each other." The reporter nodded, clearly moved by his words. "Thank you, sir," she said softly before turning back to the camera. Across the country, news outlets ran the story of the Sunnyside Café and Joe Morrison, the veteran who had been denied service but who found unexpected allies in a group of bikers and a small-town community. Back in Ashwood, the crowd outside the café continued to grow, the power of unity on full display. Joe sat quietly in his chair, the gentle hum of motorcycles and murmured conversations surrounding him. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for what the future might hold. The Sunnyside Café, once a bustling hub of the Ashwood community, now stood eerily quiet. The cheerful clinking of plates, the hum of conversation, and the smell of fresh coffee had been replaced by an unsettling silence. The large windows that once revealed families enjoying breakfast and friends sharing laughter now framed empty tables and chairs, lifeless and abandoned. The once vibrant chalkboard sign at the entrance had faded, its welcoming message smudged and forgotten. Hank Dawson sat alone at the counter, his face drawn and weary. The cash register, which once rang cheerfully with each transaction, had been quiet for days. Business had plummeted after the events surrounding Joe Morrison. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, and soon people stopped coming. First, it was a trickle, a few regulars finding new places to eat, but soon it became a wave. Families chose other diners, young people protested on social media, and even Hank's staunchest supporters found it harder to look him in the eye. The turning point came when the bikers returned the next morning, not just to protest, but to take a stand. Their peaceful presence, combined with the news crews and the community rallying behind Joe, had exposed Hank's actions to the world. And the world had responded. Hank had tried to weather the storm, but it was no use. He watched helplessly as his cafe, his pride and joy crumbled. He'd never expected consequences like this. He had always believed that what happened within the walls of his business was his own concern. Now, as he sat staring at an empty cafe, he realized too late how wrong he'd been. 3 weeks later, Joe Morrison found himself sitting on the bench outside the cafe. The old oak tree above him provided welcome shade, but the sight of the abandoned cafe brought mixed emotions. He remembered the day he'd walked in, hoping for a quiet breakfast, only to find himself at the center of a storm he hadn't asked for. Joe tapped his cane lightly against the pavement as he considered everything that had happened. The rally, the support, the unity, it had all been overwhelming. For the first time in years, he had felt seen. But the silence of the cafe weighed on him now. While he didn't wish harm on anyone, seeing the place empty felt like a kind of justice. "Morning, Joe." The familiar voice broke his thoughts. He looked up to see Tom Grizzly Green and 2 of his biker friends walking toward him. Grizzly's large frame and weathered face were hard to miss, but today his expression was lighter, almost hopeful. "Morning, Grizzly," Joe said, tipping his cap. "What brings you around?" Grizzly gestured toward the empty cafe. "This place—" He paused, running a hand through his gray beard. "We've been thinking, Joe, that it doesn't have to stay like this. It doesn't have to be a reminder of what went wrong. It could be something better." Joe raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued. "Better? How so?" Grizzly sat down on the bench beside Joe, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "Me and the boys, we've been talking. We're going to buy this place." Joe blinked in surprise. "You're going to buy the cafe?" "That's right," Grizzly said firmly. "We've pooled our resources, and we're putting in an offer to Hank. He's ready to sell. Doesn't have much choice, really. But we don't want to just run a cafe. We want to turn this place into something special. A place where everyone's welcome, no matter who they are." Joe's brow furrowed as he listened. "What exactly are you planning?" "We're going to call it the Honor Cafe," Grizzly said, his voice softening. "It'll be dedicated to veterans, all veterans. A place where people can come together, share a meal, and feel like they belong. No divisions, no hatred, just good food, good company, and respect." Joe felt his throat tighten as Grizzly's words sank in. He turned his gaze back to the cafe. The windows still streaked with dust. The sign above the door faded. For so long, this place had symbolized division and shame. Could it really become something else? Something good? "Why me?" Joe asked quietly, turning to Grizzly. "Why are you telling me this?" Grizzly smiled faintly. "Because you're the reason we're doing it, Joe. You reminded us of why we served, why we stood together, and we want you to be part of this." Joe looked away, his thoughts swirling. A part of him wanted to decline. He'd never been one to seek the spotlight, and this felt too big, too much. But another part of him, a quieter, hopeful part, felt something stir inside. The idea of this place becoming a beacon of unity instead of division. It was almost too good to believe. "I don't know," Joe said finally, his voice hesitant. "I'm not sure what I can offer you." Grizzly chuckled, clapping a hand on Joe's shoulder. "Just being you is enough, Joe. You're the heart of this. We want you there when we reopen it. We want you to cut the ribbon, sit in the front booth, and drink the first cup of coffee served." Joe shook his head, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. "You're a stubborn man, Grizzly." "That's what my mama used to say," Grizzly replied with a grin. "So, what do you say? Will you help us make this happen?" Joe looked back at the cafe, his thoughts lingering on all that it had represented. The pain, the humiliation, and what it could become. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said softly. "Let's do it." The transformation happened quickly. Hank accepted the biker's offer without argument, eager to distance himself from the cafe that had become a symbol of his downfall. Grizzly and his crew wasted no time, gathering volunteers from the community to clean, paint, and restore the space. By the time the doors reopened, the Sunnyside Cafe had been reborn as the Honor Cafe. A new sign hung proudly above the entrance, its bold lettering framed by an American flag and a simple tagline, dedicated to those who serve, past, present, and future. Inside, the walls were adorned with photos of veterans from all walks of life, black, white men, women, their stories displayed with pride. A corner of the cafe featured a memorial wall for fallen soldiers, where visitors could leave notes and tributes. The tables, once mismatched and worn, had been polished and refinished, each with a small plaque honoring a veteran. On opening day, the community gathered once again, not in protest, but in celebration. Joe stood at the front of the crowd, his military cap perched proudly on his head. Grizzly handed him a pair of scissors and gestured toward the bright red ribbon stretched across the entrance. "Go on, Joe," Grizzly said, smiling. "This is your moment." Joe's hands trembled slightly as he cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in a long time, Joe felt something he thought he'd lost: hope. As the doors opened and people began to pour inside, Joe took a seat at the front booth, just as Grizzly had promised. A waitress brought him a steaming cup of coffee, and Joe took a slow sip, letting the moment settle in. The Honor Cafe was more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of second chances, of community, and of the quiet power of standing together. The morning of the grand reopening dawned bright and clear, the golden sun spilling over Ashwood like a promise. The Honor Cafe, once a symbol of exclusion, stood proudly at the corner of Main Street, now a beacon of unity and second chances. Fresh paint gleamed on its exterior, the large windows sparkled, and a new sign hung boldly above the door: the Honor Cafe, dedicated to those who serve, past, present, and future. A large red ribbon stretched across the entrance, fluttering gently in the breeze. Balloons in patriotic colors lined the railings, and long tables had been set up outside, covered with bright tablecloths and laden with fresh pastries, coffee, and fruit. The hum of excitement buzzed in the air as townspeople, bikers, and veterans alike gathered for the occasion. Families brought their children. Elderly couples held hands as they approached, and friends greeted one another with hugs and laughter. At the center of it all was Joe Morrison, dressed in his neatly pressed military jacket and cap. Joe sat in a front-row seat reserved just for him, the place of honor. His cane rested beside him, but his posture was as straight as it had been in his younger years. A small smile tugged at his lips as he watched the scene unfold around him. The sight of so many people, so many different kinds of people, brought a warmth to his chest he hadn't felt in decades. The community had come together, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Tom Grizzly Green stood a few feet away, rallying his biker crew as they set up chairs and adjusted the sound system for the opening ceremony. The bikers had played an instrumental role in bringing the cafe back to life, and their pride showed on every face. Grizzly caught Joe's eye and gave him a wink, his rough demeanor softened by the moment. "Looking good, Joe," he said, walking over to clap a hand on Joe's shoulder. Joe grinned. "You don't look too bad yourself, Grizzly." Grizzly chuckled, glancing toward the growing crowd. "You ready for this? It's your big day." Joe shook his head slightly, his voice low but steady. "I never wanted any of this attention, you know. I'm just a man who came for breakfast." "Yeah, but what happened here is bigger than breakfast," Grizzly replied. "This place, this whole thing, it started because of you. You reminded us what we stand for, Joe. Now look what's come of it." Joe glanced around again. The sight of veterans in uniform mingling with bikers in leather jackets, children laughing alongside older couples, and townspeople chatting like old friends. It was hard to argue with Grizzly's words. At that moment, Sarah stepped up to the microphone near the entrance, her voice carrying across the crowd. She had traded her waitress apron for a smart blazer and slacks, the new manager of the Honor Café. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her smile was bright and confident. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and warm. "Thank you all for coming out today to celebrate the reopening of this cafe. The Honor Café is more than just a place to eat. It's a place to gather, to share stories, and to honor those who've served our country. And none of this would have been possible without the vision and support of this community and one very special man." All eyes turned to Joe. His heart thudded in his chest as Sarah gestured toward him, her smile softening. "Mr. Joe Morrison, would you do us the honor of cutting the ribbon and officially opening the Honor Cafes?" The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of clapping and cheers rolling through the street. Joe felt his face grow hot as Grizzly and another biker helped him to his feet. He shook his head slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Y'all are making a fuss over nothing," he muttered, though his voice betrayed the emotion he was trying to hide. "You've earned it," Grizzly said, guiding him toward the ribbon. Sarah handed Joe a pair of oversized golden scissors, her hand steady this time. Joe gripped the scissors firmly, taking a deep breath as he looked out at the crowd. For a moment, his mind flashed back to other ceremonies he'd been a part of, military parades, medals being pinned to his chest, funerals for fallen brothers. Those memories clung to him, but this was different. It was alive. It was hope. Joe cleared his throat. "Before I do this, I just want to say something." The crowd quieted, hanging on his words. "I didn't expect any of this," Joe said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "When I walked into this place that day, I just wanted some scrambled eggs and coffee. But sometimes, hope shows up when you least expect it. I've seen a lot in my lifetime. I've fought for freedom overseas, and I've seen folks struggle to find freedom right here at home. This place, it's more than a cafe now. It's a reminder that we can stand together, no matter who we are or where we come from." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and a few people wiped at their eyes. Joe smiled faintly. "So let's eat some breakfast, share some stories, and remember that respect has no color. Thank you all for being here today." With that, Joe snipped the ribbon cleanly, and the crowd erupted into cheers and applause once more. The Honor Café was officially open. The doors swung open, and people flooded inside, eager to see the transformation. The cafe buzzed with energy, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filling the air. Veterans shook hands. Bikers laughed with townspeople, and children raced to snag seats by the windows. Joe was guided to a front booth, the best seat in the house, where a steaming cup of coffee awaited him. Sarah approached with a smile, setting the cup gently in front of him. "There you go, Mr. Morrison," she said softly. "On the house. This place wouldn't exist without you." Joe looked up at her, his dark eyes misty. He shook his head slowly, a warm smile breaking through. "I'm just one man, Sarah. It took all of us to make this happen." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "But someone had to take the first step. That someone was you." Joe took a sip of the coffee, savoring its warmth. Around him, the sound of laughter, conversation, and clinking dishes filled the room. He leaned back in the booth, his heart full in a way it hadn't been for years. Grizzly appeared at his side, sliding into the seat across from him. "So, what do you think?" Joe looked around the cafe, taking in the sight of families, veterans, bikers, and townspeople all sharing the space, their divisions forgotten. "It's more than I ever could have imagined," Joe said softly. "It's hope." Grizzly smiled. "Hope shows up when you least expect it." Joe nodded, his eyes drifting out the window where the sun now bathed the town in its warm glow. "It sure does." Months had passed since the Honor Café had opened its doors, and it had already transformed Ashwood in ways no one could have imagined. The café, once the center of a divisive incident, had become the heart of the community, a place of unity, compassion, and purpose. The hum of life radiated from the building every day. Veterans gathered in groups at their favorite booths, swapping stories and laughing over coffee. Families brought children who dashed outside to play beneath the oak tree. The cafe had become more than just a place to eat. It was a refuge, a hub for hope and healing. Inside, the decor told a story. The walls were adorned with photos of veterans from every background: black, white, Hispanic, Asian, men and women. Some were in black and white, showing young soldiers in worn uniforms, their eyes filled with determination. Others were bright and modern, capturing veterans smiling with their families. One corner of the cafe housed a quiet memorial, its centerpiece a plaque that read, "Dedicated to all who served, and to the belief that dignity belongs to everyone." Fresh flowers and handwritten notes appeared there regularly, left by visitors who wanted to honor loved ones. A small candle burned constantly, a quiet, flickering tribute to sacrifice. Veterans groups began hosting meetings in the cafe twice a week, offering support and camaraderie to those who needed it most. On weekends, the Honor Cafe became a space for town hall discussions, charity events, and youth mentorship programs. A job board had even been added near the door, connecting veterans with employment opportunities through local businesses. For Joe Morrison, seeing it all unfold was like watching a dream he hadn't known he had come to life. One sunny Saturday morning, Joe sat in his usual booth near the window, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and laughter. Outside, children played tag beneath the oak tree, their shouts of joy floating through the open window. Across from Joe sat Tom Grizzly Green, whose bikers had been instrumental in transforming the cafe. Today, Grizzly looked almost at peace, his usual rough demeanor softened as he sipped his coffee. "Place looks good, doesn't it?" Grizzly said, surveying the bustling cafe. Joe smiled faintly, his eyes shining with pride. "Better than good. It's alive. You can feel it. The energy, the hope." Grizzly nodded, his gaze following Joe's to the group of veterans at the back table. They were deep in conversation, laughing heartily as one of them recounted an old story. "Those guys come here twice a week now. Said it's the first time in years they've had a place to just belong." Joe's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. Belonging. That's what it's all about, isn't it? We fought for this country, and all we ever wanted was to feel like we had a place in it. Grizzly set down his mug and looked Joe squarely in the eye. "You gave us that place, Joe. None of this would have happened without you." Joe shook his head slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm just one man, Grizzly. It took all of us to make this happen. Sarah, you, the bikers, the town, everyone stood together. That's how change happens. That's how hope shows up." As if on cue, Sarah approached the table, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She'd taken on her role as cafe manager with grace and confidence, her smile as warm as ever. "Need a top-off, Joe?" she asked brightly. Joe held out his mug. "You read my mind, Sarah." She poured the coffee, then paused to look at Joe with quiet admiration. "You know, this place wouldn't exist without you. You started something bigger than all of us." Joe looked up at her, his voice soft but steady. "I just wanted breakfast that day. I never expected any of this." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening. "Well, sometimes hope shows up when you least expect it." Outside the window, the children's laughter continued, a reminder of the brighter future being built. Joe watched them play, his heart full. Among the children were young boys and girls of all races, their joy unburdened by prejudice. To Joe, it was a glimpse of the world he and his generation had fought for, a world where dignity belonged to everyone. Grizzly followed Joe's gaze. "Look at Em," he said, his voice quieter now. "That's the next generation. They don't carry the weight we did. Maybe they won't have to." Joe nodded, his eyes lingering on a little girl who paused to pick up a fallen leaf, marveling at its color. "That's the hope, isn't it? That they'll grow up in a world better than the one we knew." Grizzly smiled faintly. We're getting there, Joe. Bit by bit, Joe took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his years, but also a lightness he hadn't known in decades. He looked toward the cafe entrance where the plaque stood proudly. People paused to read it as they entered. Its message as clear and unshakable as ever, dedicated to all who served, and to the belief that dignity belongs to everyone. Later that day, as the crowd began to thin and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Joe lingered at his booth. The hum of the cafe softened to a murmur as people lingered over their last cups of coffee. Grizzly had left hours earlier, but Sarah remained, clearing tables with a satisfied smile. Joe gazed out the window, watching the golden light filter through the oak tree's branches. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Sometimes, he whispered to himself, hope really does show up when you least expect it. The Honor Café had become more than a building. It was a legacy, a living reminder that kindness, unity, and courage could change the world, even in small, quiet ways.